very warm welcome. So as you probably know by now, in fact I'm sure you do, our theme for the last 3 months has been, well, we call it radical reality, although the original concept, if you like, was shocking Buddhist ideas. So we've been looking at some Buddhist ideas that are just completely counter everything that our society just assumes must be the case. At least that's what that was our goal. But these are ideas which actually, because they accord with reality, can free us to live a much more fulfilled life, a much more free life, a much more real life. So last week, Maitri Dasa showed us how our feelings, well, I don't know what to quite say, we had three titles. Our feelings aren't important, our feelings...
Feelings aren't as important as you think.
Feelings aren't as important as you think.
Don't take feelings so seriously. Don't listen to your feelings so much.
And yeah, there was, I think for some people it was like, well, what he's saying is true, but that's really annoying. So that's the sort of, that's a success, that's a real, we hit the bullseye with a shocking Buddhist idea. And tonight is our last talk in the series. And as it's pretty much the winter solstice, I'm going to explore a very seasonal story that illustrates at least 4 shocking Buddhist ideas, some of which we've actually had before. And this is the Christmas Carol, okay? Dickens' Christmas Carol. And this talk has been entitled Death and the Deathless. So I thought it might attract you. I thought if I called it the Christmas Carol, I was going to go yawn. So I thought, well, that might. No, that's not the only reason. So the first shocking Buddhist idea I'd like to illustrate with this talk, with this story, is that a really keen awareness of death, our own mortality, impermanence of our own impermanence, is not something morbid. It's not something to be avoided. It is in fact key to living well, to living in accord with reality. So the talk is called Death and the Deathless because an awareness of death, without an awareness of death, we're very unlikely to progress towards enlightenment, which in Buddhism is called the deathless. So we need to know about death. We need to have that in our mind to move towards the deathless. An awareness of death is very connected with spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. And of course, the story of Scrooge, the story of the Christmas Carol, starts in a way with him being made aware of his death. Him being made aware of his death is what finally precipitates the sort of big turning around in him. But also in this talk, I'd like to introduce 3 other ideas that run counter to our usual accepted way of looking at things. And the first of these ideas, so that's the second, that's death. The second, I'm not going to tell you what it is now, but when I tell you what it is, you're going to say, ha, I know that already. That's not shocking. And I'm going to try and show you that although you might think you know it, although we might all think we know it, we don't. So I'm going to try and do that when we get to it. Well, I'm trying to try and do that at the end. And then I'm also going to, the third shocking Buddhist idea is the reason why we don't know the second shocking Buddhist idea. And then the fourth one has got nothing to do with any of them. So I hope that's not too confusing. Death and the deathless. Death. The knowing about death, being aware of our mortality is a positive spiritual state. The second one, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you probably think you already know it, but you don't. Well, that's putting it strongly. I'm going to suggest that most of us probably don't know it in the way that we think we do. The third idea is the reason for that, and the fourth is something else. It might become apparent as we get closer to it. So as it's a festive story, it's a festive break, festive time of year, it's a festive story. It's the Christmas Carol. It's the story of Scrooge. And okay, the story of Scrooge, the Christmas Carol, it gets a bit close to sentimentality at times. It's been overdone and sentimentalised in film and on TV. And it glorifies Christmas, which in our time has become a tacky consumerist extravaganza. But nevertheless, it's a really, really wise story, actually, that tells us a lot. So our story starts by introducing us to Ebenezer Scrooge, a character whose very name has passed into our culture. That's how famous he is. He's an archetype, is Scrooge. And as you all well know, of course, what is Scrooge? He's a miser. He's a miser. So he's a well-off businessman. He's a well-off businessman. And Dickens describes him as squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous. He says he is secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. So he's in a shell like an oyster. He's in a shell like an oyster. Dickens says, the cold within him froze his old features, nipped at his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, made his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature around with him. He iced his office in the summer, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So the main metaphor that Dickens uses to describe Scrooge is cold. But then he also brings out very clearly that that coldness is connected to the fact that he is trapped in himself. He's trapped in himself like an oyster. He's in a shell. He's cut off from others. Self-contained, secret, solitary as an oyster. He's cut off from others. He's cut off from reality. He's the opposite of connected. So in the story of the Christmas Carol, Christmas is approaching, as it is now. And one of the things that happens is a group of people come around collecting for the poor. And Scrooge, of course, refuses to give them anything. And he tells them it's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. I think there have been some politicians who say things a bit like that. He's very much the individualist. I'll look after myself. Others should look after themselves. Very much the individualist, very much trapped in his own shell. Dickens tells us nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with a glad face, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When are you going to come to see me?" Nobody ever said that to him. But what did Scrooge care? Scrooge didn't care a thing. So once again, he's complete. He's got no relationships with others, no positive relationships with others. He's material. The other things that Dickens brings out about him is he's materialistic in every sense of the word. He's rational and he's cynical. He only values what can be seen and measured. So when his poor nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, it's a very telling little episode, this. His poor nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas. And Scrooge replies, "Humbug." "Ah, humbug!" But thank you. I like a bit of audience participation. Humbug. And he goes, "Merry Christmas." So this is the really telling bit. So after saying "bah, humbug," he says, "Merry Christmas? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." And his nephew actually is quite quick-witted, so his nephew says, well, what reason have you to be dismal then? You're rich enough. So yeah, yes, I mean, Scrooge is miserable. Scrooge is miserable. Despite his wealth, he is less happy than his poor nephew. He's miserable, but he would never say he was miserable. He thinks he's better than people like his poor nephew. He looks down on them. He would never say of himself that he was miserable. He doesn't know he's miserable, but he's miserable. And to me, Scrooge seems very much in keeping somehow with the spirit of our times. The message we're bombarded with in the media is the way to be happy is to be rich, to have stuff, lots of possessions. So we have to sacrifice everything to economic growth. Economic growth is the god in our society. Having more and more money, more and more stuff as a society and as individuals is the key to human well-being. That seems to be an accepted fact. And I'll say a bit more about that. We don't seem to have noticed that we're already rich enough, like Scrooge. And yet so many people live unfulfilled lives that are dismal, like Scrooge. So this is my second Buddhist idea, which you won't find shocking. You're probably going to say, oh, it's so obvious. Wealth doesn't bring well-being. Beyond a certain level that we need to live a simple, dignified life, no correlation between wealth and happiness. In fact, maybe even an inverse one. You're going to say, well, we all know that. That's obvious Buddhism. That's a total truism. Well, I'm going to challenge you, and later on challenge you to do a little thought experiment, which I think will show that maybe we don't all know that as much as we think we do. Okay. But that's our second, not very shocking Buddhist idea, but you try putting it into practice. So that's our second one. That wealth is not going to bring well-being at all. Our connectedness brings well-being. So Scrooge is miserable. He's a miserable man. He's dismal. He's miserable. He lives in a dismal world. He lives in a dismal emotional state. So, and what he does with that miserableness is he turns it on others as unpleasantness and cynicism. So although, it's Christmas Eve, and according to sort of Dickens' mindset, everybody's supposed to be very nice to each other, Scrooge is thoroughly nasty to his nephew, his poor nephew. And he refuses his invitation to Christmas dinner. So his nephew invites him to Christmas dinner. I don't come to Christmas dinner. And then he's thoroughly nasty to the charity collectors that I talked about before. He says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if some do die, that will reduce the surplus population. So he's all reason and no human empathy whatsoever. He's thoroughly nasty to his poor put-upon clerk, Bob Cratchit. And then, as a very, very cold and foggy night begins to fall, it's just twilight, he's making his way home through the gathering gloom. And it's just about dark as he gets home. In the gloom, he has a sort of hallucination. So he reaches for the doorknob, and instead of the doorknob, he sees the head of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, who has been dead these past 6 years. So he sees the head of his dead partner. So he recoils in shock. But then he reminds himself that he's a down-to-earth rationalist. He probably says bar humbug to himself. And he collects himself together and he opens the door. And then he double locks the door because he's such the materialist that he thinks he can lock out what's troubling him. But then he gets into the hallway of his big house, his big, empty, gloomy house, and he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin going up the wide stairs. And when he gets into his dark, gloomy living room, he sees his really ornate fireplace. He's got an ornate carved fireplace. And which is carved with all sorts of figures, and he thinks that each figure has the head of his dead partner, Bob Marley. Jacob Marley. It would have been funny if it had been funny. Anyway, back into no humour. Dark, dismal house. Dark, dismal house. Lock the door, seeing things, and then a bell starts to toll. Boing, boing, and he hears the clanking of chains. This isn't the right spirit, I'm telling you. Somebody's dragging chains across the floor, and Jacob Marley's ghost appears to him, looking very miserable and completely wrapped up in these chains. So all this stuff about the ghost, about death, the appearance of the ghost, we could say it's the sort of eruption of some knowledge about reality into Scrooge's mind, the reality of impermanence and death. It's a fact, we're all going to die. But Scrooge still tries to defend himself. He still tries to defend himself with his old defence of cynical scepticism. So he even tries to make a joke to himself about this. He sees Bob Marley, Jacob Marley's ghost, with the chains and all of that. And he says, this vision is more like, a vision like this is something more the result of a bad dinner, and Marley's ghost smells more of gravy than of the grave. It's a weak joke. But, he's trying to diffuse it for himself. He doesn't want to know about this. But Jacob Marley's ghost is not to be put off. He tells Scrooge that because of his self-centered life, in which he didn't care about anyone but himself, he is doomed to wander in chains. He says the chains are of his own making. He made them by the way he lived his life, and he has to drag them around. So he says, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Would you like to know the weight of the strong coil you wear yourself? It was as heavy as mine 7 years ago, and you have made it even heavier since. So he tells Scrooge that he's come to warn him. He says that Scrooge has spent a long time making just such a chain for himself. And he warns him that unless he changes his life, he will face the same sort of horrible fate, doomed to wander around as an unhappy spirit, dragging the chains he himself has created by his actions, forever doomed to regret having wasted the opportunity to do something positive with his life while he was alive. So Jacob Marley's ghost shows Scrooge the reality of impermanence and death, which he would much rather forget, actually. He shows him the reality of the law of karma. That's what the chains are about, isn't it? He made them by his actions. He created his own karma. And he points out to Scrooge that he has a precious opportunity and that he will regret it if he wastes it. So those of you who know about the 4 reminders, or the 4 thoughts that turn the mind, as they're sometimes called, 4 traditional reflections that many Buddhists use to align their thoughts with the Dharma, with reality, you might recognise those messages that Jacob Marley's ghost gives Scrooge. So Jacob Marley's ghost thrusts 3 of the 4 traditional reflections, the 4 traditional reminders into Scrooge's face. And these are the reality of impermanence and death, is the first one. The fact that this human life is a precious opportunity is the second one. And The scary reality of the law of karma is the third one. There's another one, but I won't go into it. We really can make chains for ourselves by the way we choose to live and act. And those chains can trap us and weigh us down. Or we can make, well, speaking metaphorically, we can make wings for ourselves. We can either become heavy and dragged down, we can become lighter and freer by the way we live our life. And that's, of course, what the chains represent, that Jacob Marley and Scrooge made very, very heavy chains for themselves. So getting back to our story, out of concern for his old business partner, Scrooge, Jacob Marley's ghost gives him this terrible warning. Tells him he's got to change, or he'll be very, very miserable. He will just have this terrible fate. And he says he will see 3 more spirits before the night is out. But that's completely in character for Scrooge, for someone who is all reason and completely out of touch with his emotions. So Scrooge says, you've already warned me. Can't we do without the 3 spirits? What do we need the 3 spirits for? You know, I've been warned. In other words, I now know with my head what you're telling me. And that's quite enough. But Marley's ghost tells him it doesn't work that way. There won't be any real change unless he experiences the emotions that the 3 spirits are going to lead him to experience. He might know he needs to change with his head, but the 3 spirits that are to come will cause emotional change. The emotional change that he needs. He needs to be moved in his own being and not just know something with his head. So that is I'll say more about each of these later on, but that's the third Buddhist idea that I think this story illustrates, that it's not enough to know something with your head. It's not enough to know something with your head. Knowing something with our head really doesn't make much difference usually to the way we live our lives. If we want to actually change the way we live our lives, we have to have an emotional experience which transforms us. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Scrooge just wants to get it over with. I know it in my head, why do I need to do anything else? You might remember the story we always tell on introductory classes about the rider and the horse. It's as though the intellect is the rider and thinks it's going over there, but the horse is the deeper motivations, the emotions, and where the horse is going, it wants to go, it goes. And it's very often not where the rider thinks it's going. So it's not enough to know with the head. You have to tell the horse. And the horse is only convinced by something which causes a change at quite a deep level. And that's what the other ghosts are about. They're about causing an emotional transformation to go along with the rational knowledge. So Scrooge says, well, Marley's ghost says, well, you're going to have these three ghosts, these 3 spirits. And Scrooge says, well, can't we have them all at once and save some time? Same idea, really. So sure enough, in the course of the night, 3 different ghosts appear to Scrooge as he tries to get some sleep in his big, dark, gloomy house. So the first one that appears at 1 a.m. is the ghost of Christmas past. And this ghost wants to show Scrooge some things from the past. But Scrooge doesn't want to know. Scrooge really isn't into this at all. He is anything but receptive. So light shines from the ghost, and Scrooge tries to sort of snuff it out, put a blanket over it or something. He doesn't want it. And the ghost seems to be associated with the light of awareness of things that Scrooge doesn't want to remember or be conscious of because they're painful. So Scrooge isn't cooperating, so the ghost has to take Scrooge on a journey against his will. And it carries him out into the night over London, over the surrounding countryside, until he gets to a landscape that he remembers from his childhood. And there he's shown himself as a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and neglected. sitting reading by himself. And he feels compassion for the suffering of his younger self. And this immediately turns into compassion for other children, like the child he was. And he gets an uprush of regret for having turned away a child like himself who came to his door begging for food. So when he opens up to his own suffering, painful as this may be, that suffering connects him with others. And this is the third Buddhist idea that I think we can get from this story. The fact that becoming aware of our own suffering, while it might not be what we want to do, is actually quite essential for us. We shouldn't hide from our suffering. We need to use it to connect us with others. If we seek to hide from it, well, one of the things that happens is if we cut off some emotions, we cut off all emotions, or we tend to freeze ourselves, a bit like Scrooge who got frozen. And also sort of lurking in the background, it cuts us off from others. Scrooge is suffering, and he turns that suffering outwards into nastiness to others. And this is why, because he's not, the reason he is as he is because he was that child. The reason he is as he is because he was a miserable, neglected child. And if he doesn't deal with that, he's not going to change, basically. So he has to sort of accept that. That's the first thing. It's because of that he's in this hard shell. That he's in like an oyster, self-contained like an oyster. So he's also shown, that's the third of these ideas, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit. So he's also shown his own sister who died quite young, and he re-experiences his fond feelings for his sister. And he's also shown himself in his first job with his close friend Dick and his employer, his very kind employer, who goes by the very Dickensian name of Mr. Fezziwig. His very kind employer, and he remembers the kindness of his employer, and he remembers the kindness of his friend, Dick, and he feels this really strong uprush of gratitude. So gratitude has this sort of transformative effect on him. And at this point, the ghost sort of mocks. He mocks Scrooge's former attitudes. Once upon a time, Scrooge would have been very cynical about any display of emotion. So the ghost mocks his previous attitudes. He says words that Scrooge might himself have said. He said, yeah, it's a small matter to make these silly folks full of gratitude. That's just the sort of thing that Scrooge himself might have said once. But anyway, it's this uprush of gratitude, and then the ghost vanishes. But the arising of some human sympathy for others, getting more in touch with his emotions, etc., some recognition of his own suffering, connection with the suffering of others, memory of warm feelings, he's suppressed to protect himself, his gratitude for the benefits he's received, all of these have started a change in Scrooge. So when the next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge is open to what it has to say. He's not like he was before. He's now open to what it has to say. He's receptive. And he says, in fact, if you've got anything to teach me, let me profit by it. So he's changed quite a lot already. And this ghost, the ghost of Christmas Present, basically shows Scrooge other people enjoying Christmas. Or rather, what he shows is other people enjoying their warm, close relationships with others. He shows Scrooge the joy of relatedness and connectedness in other people's lives. He shows him especially people he thinks he's better than because he's got more money than. He's rich and they're poor. So he shows his poor nephew that he said bar humbug to, with his friends and his fiancée, delighting in their friendship and warmth for each other. And he shows him his poor, unprepossessing clerk, Bob Cratchit, who turns out to be not so poor after all, because he's got a much richer life than Scrooge because he loves others and he's loved by others in his family. And hardest to take of all, he's shown himself as he looks in other people's eyes. So he sees that other people, far from thinking that he's better than them because he's got more money, far from respecting him, they actually feel sorry for him. They actually feel sorry for him for the way he's cut off from human relationships, from positive emotions. So that's quite a big dose of medicine to take. All the things that you've avoided are what really make people happy. The way you've lived your life, actually, people feel sorry for you for it. They don't feel you're better than them. Quite a thing to take. And then finally, in the last watches of the night, the third spirit appears to him. The ghost of Christmas yet to be, the ghost of future Christmases. And he sees his own death. And he sees the legacy that he leaves behind. He sees the important businessmen who he thinks of as his peers, the people he thinks, the other rich guys in the town who he thinks are his peers, the people whose respect he wants, and he sees what they really think of him. And one of them says, well, it will be a very cheap funeral because no one will go. And somebody else says, well, maybe I'll go for the free lunch. So that he sees he hasn't got any friends in the world. He hasn't got anyone who regrets his death. There's nobody who regrets his death. He sees that people steal his possessions, they take his possessions when he's no longer there, he's got no one to hand them to, and there's nothing he can do about it. All these things that he's hoarded just go. And he sees himself dying alone, lonely and miserable. And he thinks these words, avarice, hard dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end truly. So he sees his own death. And he's horrified. And he asks the spirit, isn't there anybody who feels any regret at my death? And he's shown a couple who owe him money and are near to being thrown out of their house because they're not paying their mortgage. And he hears them say how glad they are that he's dead, because whoever the debt passes to couldn't possibly be as hard-hearted as he is. So, I mean, wouldn't that be a terrible thing? Wouldn't that be a terrible thing to be dying and to know that nobody regretted our death? And in fact, some people would be very glad of it because of the negative effect our living has on them. What a thing to be shown, really. And then he sees the future. He sees the future after his death. Someone else is in his chair in his office. Everything carries on as it was. He might as well never have been. The only sign of his life is an overgrown gravestone that nobody looks after. And then, as the morning dawns, the ghost of Christmas yet to be morphs into a bedpost. So he thinks he's dead. He really thinks he's dead. But then the ghost of Christmas yet to be changes back into his bedpost. And he realises that he's not dead after all. He's not dead after all. And he's had a reprieve. He's been given an amazing opportunity. He still has his precious human opportunity. He still has a chance to do something to change himself and have a positive impact on the world. And because of the emotional transformations that have happened to him, connecting with his feelings, connecting with his own suffering, connecting with positive feelings, seeing the truth of where his happiness is going to come from, seeing the effect he's had on the world, seeing what people think of him. He's had a complete transformation, a spiritual death. The old Scrooge has died and a new one has been born. And he says, I'm light as a feather. I'm happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy, as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody, a Happy New Year to all the world. Whoop! I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I'm quite a baby. I don't know anything. Spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Whoop! So, for those of you who are familiar with the stages of Stangarashta's stages of the spiritual life, he's had a profound emotional experience, and this has led him to a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth. The old Scrooge has died and a new one is born. So he sends a turkey to his downtrodden clerk, Ben Cratchit, by taxi. He gives a large sum of money to the charity collectors he mocked, and he goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a thoroughly enjoyable time. He's completely changed. He's reborn as a happy man. Dickens says of him, he became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened in this globe for good, which some people did not laugh at, basically. And knowing that such as these were blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grin as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. So, very happy ending. Festive ending. Okay, what about these shocking, or not so shocking, Buddhist ideas? Well, so first of all, as I said, we've got the idea that a real awareness of our own impermanence, our own death, is a positive thing, not a negative thing. It's not some morbid thing. It's when Scrooge sees the fact of his own death and the legacy that he leaves behind him, and that's when the penny really drops for him. It's not until that point that the big change in him is finally complete. A knowledge of death makes us get real. We see we've got limited time, that we need to use it well. It makes most of our worldly concerns look unimportant and trivial. So who wants a gravestone that says he had a big pension and he managed his money prudently? Or who wants a gravestone that says she was a fairly successful middle manager with a nice 4-bedroom house on which she had nearly paid off the mortgage? When we're brought near to an awareness of death, maybe through an illness of our own, maybe through the death of somebody close, or maybe just by imagination and reflection, when we get brought to an awareness of death, it makes us get real. It makes small worldly concerns look trivial. And it makes relationships, in particular, look much, much more important. As one of the most important Buddhist texts, the Dhammapada, tells us, those who are aware of death will compose their quarrels. So an awareness of death is a profoundly positive thing. And the second Buddhist idea the text illustrates is the obvious one, that material wealth, beyond what's needed for a sort of simple, dignified existence, does not bring well-being, does not bring happiness. So we have Scrooge saying to his poor nephew, what have you got to be merry about? You're poor enough. He thinks that wealth brings happiness. And we have the nephew saying back, what have you got to be so dismal about? You're rich enough. The nephew seeing that despite his wealth, Scrooge is really miserable. Because Scrooge is deeply miserable. He's got lots of wealth and a big house, but he's cut off from others, disconnected, and he's deeply unhappy. Whereas his nephew is poor, is connected, and happy. So Scrooge looks down on his nephew and his poor employee, as rich people are liable to look down on those with less worldly success. But they don't look up to him, they just feel sorry for him. And this, of course, is the shocking Buddhist idea I referred to at the beginning of the talk, that you probably don't think is shocking at all. It's just obvious Buddhism, isn't it? We all know that. It's a truism of Buddhism, that a simple life is a positive thing, that wealth doesn't equate with well-being. But is it really that obvious? Is it really that obvious? It certainly isn't obvious if we take the evidence of our society, where everything is geared to economics, efficiency, getting things done with the minimum cost that you can do to get some sort of narrowly defined objective goal. So which politician was it who said, when asked what was the most important issue at the election, he said, "It's the economy, stupid." That's become sort of like a truism, isn't it? It's the economy, stupid. That's what people vote for. Which is going to give me most money? The measure of whether a government is doing well is the gross national product, how wealthy people are, and not, for example, how well the government makes it possible for people to express friendship and generosity, or community spirit in their lives. That doesn't seem to be a big election topic. But what the story of Scrooge tells us is if the goal of the government is to make the people of the country happy and fulfilled, that's the way it should be done, not through economics. But and I don't think that blindness is just restricted to politics. That blindness to that truth that wealth doesn't bring happiness is restricted to politicians. Our politicians act the way they do because they need the votes of the people who vote for them. And I'm going to be challenging and say that probably most of us don't really see the truth of that either, the truth that wealth doesn't bring well-being. Buddhists, though we are, although we would all pay lip service to it, we know it intellectually, or we probably wouldn't be Buddhists, but I bet many of us don't really know it or live completely according to it. So to test this, to see whether we really do know that wealth and possessions don't bring happiness, that it comes from other things, I'd like to invite us all to do a little thought experiment, okay? So this little thought experiment, I'd like you to imagine that you're given the choice between winning several £1 million on the lottery and having a spiritual breakthrough. So not a major spiritual breakthrough, not complete and perfect enlightenment, maybe a spiritual breakthrough like the uprush of generous feeling that Scrooge had. So an uprush of generous feeling that makes us give a lot of our wealth away. So that's the choice we're offered. Either we could win several pounds on the lottery, or we could have an uprush of generosity so that we would give away a lot of our wealth and be poorer. And I'm going to ask you to be honest. Which would you choose? If we secretly suspect that we would choose the lottery win, then we probably don't know the truth, really know the truth of that fact, that happiness, positive emotions, generosity, connectedness are the way to true happiness, as illustrated by the Christmas Carol. And incidentally, there's a sort of wriggle room in this that people sometimes think, but what I would do is give away half of what I got on the lottery and I'd still be well off, and I'd do far more good for the world. So I'm going to introduce a wriggle room destroyer, which is that adding the condition that if we choose the lottery win, we are not allowed to give any of the money away, okay? We've got to keep it all for ourselves, like Scrooge. So which would we do? Keep that 17 million, or have an uprush of generosity and give half our stuff away? Which would we rather do? Because the story tells us, well, if we really accepted that truism of Buddhism, that wealth doesn't bring happiness, it's totally unconnected with happiness, that what does is generosity, connecting to others, we choose the second. Okay, I'll leave that one with you. But the reason that most of us would probably still choose the lottery win is down to the third Buddhist idea, okay, that's in the story. And this is the truth that knowing something with the head doesn't make very much difference to the way we live and act, and to what we want at quite a deep level. It's not enough to know something with the head. We need to know it with the heart, and we need to know it with the guts. We need to know it in our depths. To use Sangarajta's words, we need to find emotional equivalents for our intellectual understandings. We might know intellectually that wealth doesn't bring happiness, but something deep down inside of us is saying, I need more. I want to be safe. I might not have enough. I want more. I want to be rich. And that's something, although it might be completely out of our consciousness, actually will override any intellectual knowledge that we might have. So yeah, we need to convince that something deep down. That's an emotional change that has to happen. So when the ghost, I mean, this is illustrating in the story by the fact that when the ghost first appears to Scrooge and tells him he must mend his ways, Scrooge understands this. He understands it intellectually. So he thinks that's enough. He says, well, I don't need the other three spirits. What do I need to hear from them about? I know it now. But the ghost won't have that. The ghost says, emotions don't work like that. Scrooge needs the three spirits. He needs the emotional change that the experience they will give him will bring about, so that he really wants to change, rather than just knowing he should, as it were. So I think we can apply this to our Dharma practice. We can know all about, for example, no self and non-duality at an intellectual level and still be totally wrapped up in self, as long as our emotions are not transformed. And because many of us don't really know that truth, that actually the emotions need to be transformed, it's not enough to know. Many of us, many Western Buddhists, we take that approach into meditation and our spiritual life. So all too often we want to get on with what are called insight practices, but we don't see the point of the other practices, either in meditation or in all sorts of other practices in our life, which are designed to bring about the deep emotional transformation that needs to go along with that. We're like Scrooge asking the ghost why he can't skip the three spirits. We want to skip friendship, metabhavana, and puja, for example, among other things. So yeah, he needed to change. He knew he needed to change, and we may know we need to change, but neither will make any difference without experiences that transform our emotions. So the metabhavana actually does more to break us out of our limited ego than any amount of insight, supposedly insight meditation, on lack of self, if that's just done with the head and not the heart. So that's the reason we don't know the second one, because we don't know it with our deep parts. And the fourth of the shocking Buddhist ideas, not so shocking maybe, is to do with suffering. So Scrooge is shown his suffering as a child when it goes to Christmas past. And he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to go and see his past. He was really resistant to it. But seeing his own suffering opened him up to the suffering of others. It connected him to others. So I think that is I'm not going to dwell on that one, but I think that's a truth that maybe we just need to take on board. As long as we seek to hide from our own suffering, we, as it were, put ourselves in that shell that Scrooge is in. We cut ourselves off from others. But in fact, our suffering can connect us to others. We can use it. So, just finally, what can we take away from this story? So what can we take away from this story? How can we have... Scrooge went through a big spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. He's a very extreme example, but are there things from that story that we can take on to give us much smaller versions, perhaps, of that sort of spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, that sort of emotional transformation? So although it was an emotional transformation in Scrooge, it came about through increased awareness. So the ghost showed him things about the past, the present, and the future. It was that increased awareness that made him change, that brought about the changes in emotions. So the ghost of Christmas past gave him an awareness of his own past suffering, and an awareness that others suffered just like him. And I think we could do to reflect on that as well, our own past suffering and the fact that others suffer like us. And want to be happy, as we do. He also was shown the kindness of others to him, and I think we could do well to reflect on the kindness of others to us in the past. The benefits we've received from them, focusing on gratitude. We do this gratitude exercise in our intermediate classes where we write down all the people we can think of we benefited from, and I think we could just do that every day. That wouldn't be a bad idea. So connecting, becoming more aware of things from the past, as the Ghost of Christmas Past makes Scrooge. And then the Ghost of Christmas Present makes Scrooge aware of the present. He especially makes him aware of people in the present. So I think in the present, we can use our awareness to connect imaginatively with others, to cultivate empathy. And we do this by practicing the metta bhavana. And finally, the ghost makes Scrooge aware of the future, of the reality of the future. So we can become aware that we can make an impact. He sees the impact he has on the world. We can become aware that we have an impact for good or bad in the future. We will all change the world by the way we live. And that's quite a thing to take on board. We're often completely unaware of it. But the way we live will change the world. So we can become aware of that, and that makes us serious. What sort of legacy do we want to leave behind us? And finally, of course, the law of karma. The ghost shows him the law of karma. The fact that the future, our own future, is dependent on the way we behave now. So I think if we were to reflect on some of those things that the ghost tells Scrooge, that would have quite a profound effect, I think. It would bring us much more in touch with reality. But it might seem like a bit much. If you have to choose one, I would suggest one that the ghost of future present might choose, which is do the metta bhavana. Do the metta bhavana. The metta bhavana is an amazing practice. It's said traditionally to make people like us, make us sleep better, make us lucky, and make us attractive. It's the best cosmetic going. There's a few others. I think there's 9. I tapped Kate's brain about this, and she could only come up with 4, but I couldn't come up with any. So, but there are some more. Even forget about enlightenment. Why wouldn't you want to do the metta bhavana? If they sold a car that gave you all of that, we'd all be going, oh, I must buy some of that. Or washing up liquid. Why would we not wish to do the metta bhavana? Even for the worldly benefits it brings. If Scrooge had done the metta bhavana, would he be like he was? If we want to be as different from Scrooge as we could possibly be, we would do the metta bhavana.